Welcome everybody to the Oswego Village Library. We're delighted to welcome Manomet Conservation Sciences for today's program about shorebirds, some of the most fascinating and important birds found on our coast. From the beaches and salt marshes of Cape Cod to the shorelines around the world, shorebirds play an important role in healthy coastal ecosystems. Today we'll learn more about the role of these remarkable birds and their incredible journeys, the challenges they face, and what we can do to help protect them in the places they depend on. Please join me in welcoming our presenters from Manomet Conservation and enjoy the fascinating look at the wonderful shorebirds, which I'm very jealous of because I've always wanted to be able to fly. And I get jealous every time I see a bird. So I'm going to turn over to Lee.
Thank you, Cindy. So this is all set. Yep. Recording.
Yep.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. And thank you to the Osterville Library as well. My name's Liana D'Annunzio, and I'm a shorebird biologist for Manomet Conservation Sciences. And my work focuses on shorebird migration here in Massachusetts. So today I'm going to be giving you all a background on the shorebirds of Cape Cod. And I'll also share with you some of Manomet's research to help us better understand shorebird migration here in Massachusetts and Cape Cod. Oh dear. Okay. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Manomet, we're a nonprofit research and conservation organization. We're based in Plymouth, Massachusetts, but we have staff working throughout the Western Hemisphere on things like coastal resiliency, education, and shorebird recovery. So I'm going to kick this off with a little shorebird background, just so we're all on the same page. And I'd like to start that with a little activity to wake everyone up. So there's a variety of birds that you can find along the shores of both fresh and saltwater bodies. If you go out to a local beach, you might see gulls, plovers, terns, ducks, and egrets, but not all of these are considered shorebirds. Actually, only one of them is a true shorebird. So do we have anyone in the audience that would like to try to spot the shorebird? You can raise your hand. Oh, yes, right here. The plover, yes. So this little guy up here is the only true shorebird on this slide. Very good. So if that was a stumper for some of you, that's totally fine. It can be confusing. So what is a shorebird anyway? So shorebirds are a distinct group of related birds in the order Quadriformes. There's about 235 species worldwide, and they include things like sandpipers, plovers, oyster catchers, avocets, curlews, and many more with very interesting sounding names. And as you can see in the photo up at the top, they come in a variety of shapes and sizes, particularly when it comes to their bills, which are well adapted to help them feed. So they range anywhere from very long and down curved, like on this curlew all the way to the left. That's designed to be probed deep into the mud to extract hard to reach prey items like crabs and clams. And then on the other side of the spectrum, all the way to the right, the tiny little plover over here has a short, blunt bill to help it pick tiny invertebrates off the surface of the sand. And then, of course, everything in between. So this slide shows a sampling of shorebird habitat. So many shorebird species do live up to their names and spend at least part of their lives along the shores of fresh and saltwater bodies and wetlands. But some shorebirds prefer drier habitats like grasslands, and some shorebirds even nest on the Arctic tundra, as you can see in this bottom photo. So a lot more variety than their names imply. They're not only on the shore. So many shorebirds are super migrators and undergo long distance migrations each year. And to illustrate this, I'm going to be using the red knot as an example. So red knots are a robin-sized sandpiper, and also like the robin, they have a pretty rusty red breast. And they begin their lives in the early summer on their Arctic breeding grounds. So that's that pink color at the top of the map where our example bird is currently located. So as soon as the young are self-sufficient, the adult birds will head south for the winter. This leaves the young birds, so the young that just hatched out that year, that leaves them behind to continue working on their feathers and building up their fat reserves. Because then a little later on in the summer, they too leave for their very first migrations ever without parental guidance. So throughout the late summer and into the fall, all the red knots head south for their wintering or non-breeding grounds. And those are all highlighted in the blue. So anywhere from the southern coast of the US to the very southern tip of South America in Tierra del Fuego, Chile. So that means that some of these birds are flying 9,000 miles south. And then in the spring, these birds repeat these journeys to head back north to their breeding grounds. So that means that some of these red knots are flying up, about 18,000 miles a year, which is just incredible. Go, little buddy, go. So shorebirds like the red knot can only fly, maybe a couple thousand miles nonstop on their fat reserves alone before they need to stop to rest and refuel. And the places that they do that at are called stopovers. And these stopover sites are absolutely crucial for these birds to be able to survive these really long distance migrations. And some key features of a quality stopover site include plenty of food. For shorebirds, this is typically invertebrates. They really need to be able to have enough food to help them refatten up because that's their fuel for the next leg of their journey. And they also need safe places to rest because once they get flying, they're flapping the entire way. They, unlike a hawk, they can't conserve energy by soaring. And unlike, say, a duck, if they're flying over water, they can't stop and rest and float on the water because they're just not very good swimmers. So it's really important that they get all of the food and rest they need at these stopover sites. So the final thing I want to bring up about shorebirds in general is unfortunately that many of their populations are in decline. So this graph comes from the 2025 State of the Birds report, and it shows the average percent change in population for different groups of birds since 1970. So you can see there's a little dashed line with the 0 through the middle of the graph. If the birds are going above that, that means they've increased in population since 1970. And if they're going below that line, that means they've declined since 1970. And unfortunately, you'll see pointed out with the arrow, shorebirds have declined an average of 33% during that period of time. And they're more imperiled than all but 2 other groups of birds. And I will note that the declines are even worse for the long distance migratory species like the red knot. And there's a variety of threats that are contributing to these shorebird population declines. Some examples are habitat loss and degradation due to things like development and pollution and climate change impacts. This may lead to limited food resources at the sites that they use. And they're also impacted by a variety of human activities, anything from recreational activities on beaches, like happens a lot here on Cape Cod, to large-scale industrial activities like energy development. And shorebirds do, of course, face predation, but not just from their wild predators, also from domestic animals like cats and dogs, and even humans. So shorebird hunting did used to be prevalent here on Cape Cod back in the 1800s and early 1900s. It is now illegal here, but shorebird hunting does still occur in places in the Caribbean and in South America. So it can be really concerning to hear about all the threats that this already declining group of birds are facing, but there is hope. Manomet and our partners throughout the Western Hemisphere are working to learn more about the causes for these population declines so we can find ways to address them and help recover shorebird populations. So when we're thinking about the long distance migratory shorebirds like the red knot, for example, since they spread their lives out through the entire hemisphere, each site that they visit plays an important role in both their overall survival and their breeding success. So when we're thinking about a conservation plan for a long distance migrant, we have to understand a couple things. We have to understand what the birds need from each site that they visit, so we can make sure they're fulfilling all of their needs at all those sites. And we also need to see if there's any threats present at the sites that they visit so we can find ways to address those threats. So we can make sure that these birds are being well supported throughout their full annual cycles. And in just a little bit, I'll be telling you about how we're doing that here on Cape Cod. But first, I'm just going to dive a little deeper on the shorebirds of Massachusetts to set the scene. So Massachusetts has over 1,500 miles of coastline, and shorebirds really enjoy our coastal habitats like beaches and salt marshes and mudflats. You may also find some further inland and freshwater habitats like freshwater wetlands and the shores of ponds and lakes. And we do have two premier shorebird sites in the state, and they're part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. So the first is the Great Marsh on the North Shore. That's a 20,000 acre salt marsh complex. And the other is probably like the premier shorebird stopover site in the state. It's Manomet National Wildlife Refuge in Chatham. They can support over 100,000 shorebirds every year. And due to their migratory nature, you'll see different species of shorebirds in Massachusetts depending on the season. So in the summertime, we have a few species that breed here, including the willet, the American oystercatcher, and the piping plover. In the winter, we host a few especially hardy shorebird species during their non-breeding season, like the purple sandpiper, the sanderling, and the dunlin. But the best time to see shorebirds in Massachusetts is when they're stopped over here during their spring and fall migrations. You can see over 25 different species of shorebird during that time. And this is the shorebird season that I'm going to be focusing the rest of my talk on. So pretty exciting. So now now that we're all situated and we know about shorebirds, especially the shorebirds of Massachusetts, I'm going to share a couple of examples of Manomet's shorebird research that's going on here on Cape Cod. So the first one I'm going to start with is a new monitoring program that we started that's helping us better understand shorebird migration here in Massachusetts. And that's the Massachusetts Shorebird Blitz. So Manomet launched the Shorebird Blitz back in 2023. So we're in our 4th year. And what the Shorebird Blitz is it's a coordinated shorebird survey of Eastern Massachusetts during peak southbound or fall migration. And the goal of the Shorebird Blitz is to get a snapshot of how shorebirds are using Massachusetts during migration. And it's also a great way to identify important shorebird stopover sites in the state. So how it works is that we try to get shorebird surveys conducted at as many sites as possible during a 9-day survey window in early to mid-August. We choose the survey window because that's kind of the peak fall migration or southbound migration. So we use the existing International Shorebird Survey protocol to count shorebirds. We take some data on the tide stage and weather, and then we enter all of that data using eBird. So that not only makes it convenient for our participants, but it also makes sure that the data contributes to the larger International Shorebird Survey database. It's always great to share data when you can, so we can get more use out of it. And I will say none of this would be possible without the 90+ participants that survey our sites every year. And these include volunteers, bird clubs, and partner organizations. So just a big thank you to the participants. I wonder if there's any in this room. And next, I'm going to share some results with you. So we actually just wrapped up the 2026 Shorebird Blitz a couple weeks ago, so I don't have those results ready to share just yet. So these are the 2025 Shorebird Blitz results. So we had 123 participants survey 232 sites. So you can see all the sites, all those little dots all over the map are Shorebird Blitz sites. And since this is a Cape Cod focused talk, there were 68 sites surveyed in Barnstable County. And we counted over 85,000 shorebirds of 25 different species. So the larger the circle on the map, the more shorebirds were counted at a site, and the more red the circle, the more species were observed at the site. So I know there's a lot going on that map, so I'm going to give you some highlights. So I'm going to start with shorebird abundance. So these are the top 5 sites with the highest number of shorebirds counted. And you can see that most of them are on Cape Cod. So we had North Manomet Island, which is part of North Manomet National Wildlife Refuge, come in at #1 with 7,469 shorebirds counted. And I will note that Manomet comes in #1 every single year for number of shorebirds, so that wasn't too surprising. The other sites, Nauset Marsh and Eastham and Orleans, Sandy Neck and Barnstable, Minimoy Island, also part of Manomet National Wildlife Refuge, and Third Cliff on the South Shore. And just to think about the Cape as a whole, over half of all the shorebirds counted for last year's Blitz were counted on Cape Cod, 52%. So pretty impressive, and it really just highlights how important Cape Cod is for these tired and hungry migrating shorebirds. So next I'm going to talk about species diversity. So these are the top 5 sites with the highest number of shorebird species observed. So we had a tie for first place with 16 species each. Tisbury Great Pond and Martha's Vineyard, Jackson Point and Nantucket. And then we had a 3-way tie for second place with 15 species each. Our 2 Monomoy subsites, and then also Tuckernuck Island in Nantucket. So the islands really shined for shorebird diversity that year. And Cape Cod as a whole, a total of 20 species were observed here. So we got a good number of shorebirds and also some good species diversity. So next I'll be giving a species highlight. So these are the top 10 most abundant shorebird species from last year's Blitz. And since we started the Blitz, we had the same 2 species come in at #1 and #2 most abundant, all 3 years that we have results for so far. And they're both small, brown, and semi-palmated. So in #1, we always have the semi-palmated sandpiper. The last year, over 35,000 were counted. And then always at #2 is a semi-palmated plover. And last year, over 23,000 were counted, which is really impressive. #3 is the sanderling, and there's just a little over 7,000 counted. So you can just see how much more abundant these 2 semi-palmated species are compared to the rest. And in case you're wondering, semi-palmated means partially webbed because they have partial webbing in between their little toes. So I will next show you the rest of the top 10 species just so you can see what they look like. So #3, sanderling. #4, oh no, its face is covered. The short-billed dowager, you got to see that bill. 5, black-bellied plover, and 6, ruddy turnstone. 7, leaf sandpiper, 8, willet, 9, greater yellowlegs, and 10, our friend the red knot from the beginning of the presentation. So what I didn't note then is that the red knot is a federally threatened species. So they're particularly vulnerable compared to some of the other shorebird species, although they're all pretty vulnerable right now. But of that 690 red knots that were counted at the Blitz last year, almost all of them were on Cape Cod, and particularly at Manomet National Wildlife Refuge. So Cape Cod is also a really important place for some of our most vulnerable shorebird species. So I'll move this back. Sorry about that. So we're really excited that we're learning more about shorebird migration here in Massachusetts, and we're building up this long-term data set. And once we start to compile a lot of data, we'll be able to use it to help guide shorebird conservation efforts here in Massachusetts. It helps, pick out the most important shorebird sites that we have. It can also tell us where the most vulnerable species are spending their time, so then we can really focus our conservation efforts. And just an example of a couple of conservation actions that we can do here on Cape Cod to help better support our migrating shorebirds. The first thing we can do is reduce disturbance at important stopover sites. So activities that, seem pretty harmless and just fun, like, driving on the beach or letting your dog run around the beach or fireworks. If there are shorebirds in the area that are just trying to rest and fatten up because they just got back from, a 2,000-mile flight, that can all those activities can keep them from resting and feeding. So they'll be less prepared for the next leg of their journey. So something simple that beachgoers can do is if you see a flock of shorebirds, you can just give them some space so they can just focus on feeding and resting, and they're well prepared for the rest of their journey. And we like to use the slogan, walk around the flock, to help people remember that. And another thing we can do here on Cape Cod is habitat restoration, especially for beaches, salt marshes, and mud flats. That will just ensure that there's plenty of habitat for all these birds to rest and feed on. So it's really exciting that we're learning more about shorebird migration here in Massachusetts, but that's not the whole story of shorebird migration. Another piece to the puzzle is, where do the birds go after they leave their Cape Cod stopover sites? And now with modern technology, we can answer those questions by tracking shorebirds throughout their full migrations. So the next portion, I'll be telling you about a Manomet study that's learning more about how shorebirds connect Cape Cod to the rest of the hemisphere. So this study focuses on the Hudsonian whimbrel. So it's one of our larger shorebird species. It's about the size of a crow. It has some distinctive dark head stripes and a long down curved bill to help it extract little fiddler crabs from its burrows, or maybe grab hard to reach blueberries off of a branch. And unfortunately, they're one of the shorebird species that has been declining over the past couple of decades, well, maybe longer than that. So Manomet and our partners throughout the Western Hemisphere have been researching them for probably the past 20 years or so to better understand their population and the causes of their decline. And one of the ways that we're doing this is by tracking them. So this map here shows the actual flight paths for whimbrel that Manomet has tracked over the years. So all of these were from adult birds, so we're able to get their full annual cycle. So everywhere from their breeding grounds in the Arctic to their non-breeding grounds in South America, and all of their migration pathways in between, including stopover sites like in Cape Cod. So Cape Cod is a reliable whimbrel stopover site during their southbound or fall migrations. And while they're here, they relax on our beaches and salt marshes and mud flats. And they also gorge themselves on the local seafood, with fiddler crabs being their favorite. And Cape Cod is also the study site for ongoing juvenile whimbrel research. So a lot of the whimbrel research that has occurred, prior to this research that we're doing now, focused on the adult birds, and little was known about their very vulnerable first few years of life. So Manomet launched this study to better understand their first migrations ever, and also their survival. And we're answering all of our questions by deploying tracking devices on juvenile whimbrel caught on Cape Cod. So since 2015, when the study started, we've deployed 14 tracking devices, and you can see that in the photo. It just sits right between the bird's wings on its back. It does not impact the bird's movement at all, and all this work is conducted by permitted professionals. And next, I'm going to share with you what we've learned from these young birds over the past 10 years. So just a reminder, these young juvenile whimbrel, before we encountered them on Cape Cod, they had just hatched out on the breeding grounds just a couple months prior. And by the time they make it to Cape Cod, they're already partway through their first migrations ever. So then when they're on Cape Cod, that's when we put the tag on and really start tracking them. So while they were still on Cape Cod, we learned a little bit about their movements here and the different habitats that they're using. We learned that they use different sites for their daytime and nighttime activities. So during the day, they're all spread out in the mainland salt marshes, most likely feeding on those fiddler crabs. So you can see the daytime sites marked by the yellow triangles. And then at night, they all head to remote sand spits and islands to sleep. And we call those nocturnal roosts. And those are indicated by the blue circles. So they fly to these more remote areas so they're safer from predators, which are more common on the mainland, things like coyotes or great horned owls. So it was really exciting to see how that they're spending their Cape Cod vacations. We also learned that there's kind of little mini Wimbrel neighborhoods, you could say. So all the birds that feed in the Wellfleet salt marshes only go to sleep at the Airbnb at Jeremy Point. And then all the birds that feed along Nantucket Sound only go to Monomoy to sleep at night. So it was interesting to see the separation of sites. And for the commutes, the birds could commute anywhere from 3 to 12 miles one way between their daytime and nighttime sites. So really interesting to see what these birds are doing on Cape Cod and what sites that they're using. But once they got their fill of fiddler crabs, it was time for them to continue their migration south. So all of the birds that left Cape Cod launched out for a nonstop flight across the Atlantic. So you can see all the different colored lines are different birds, and they're all just heading straight out over the ocean from Cape Cod. It took an average of 3 days for them to cover an average of 2,000 miles. You can see some of them have slightly different trajectories than others. And they all made first landfall either in the Caribbean or Venezuela. So really impressive. And just remember, these birds are flapping the whole time. They're not soaring. They're not stopping and floating on the water. They're just flying that entire time. But I did want to just highlight how difficult these journeys really are. So in 2024, one of our tagged juvenile Wimbrels encountered Hurricane Milton during its transatlantic flight. So you can see where it started on Cape Cod. Everything was going well for a little while, but then you can see where it hits the swirling winds of the storm. And you can see the bird kind of, its tracks also swirling with the winds as it was trying to fight to get through that. And unfortunately, this young bird did not make it, was lost out to sea somewhere east of Bermuda. So it's really hard to see, it does happen all the time, but you don't always have a tag on the bird. So definitely, very impactful, but it does really highlight the importance of stopover sites like Cape Cod to prepare these birds for these really dangerous journeys. It's so important that they get enough rest and get enough food so they're in top condition and can at least try to survive whatever challenges they might face on these journeys. So good news is that several of our birds did make it to their non-breeding grounds, which is really exciting. So you can see all of their little flight tracks coming in just into the Caribbean. So their non-breeding grounds that they settled at included British Virgin Islands, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and Brazil. And our tracking data actually showed us that these sites are really important to these young birds because they can spend an extended period of time here before they ever attempt to head back north to breed. We had some birds stay on the non-breeding grounds from like 1.5 to 2.5 years before ever attempting to head back north to breed. So these sites are probably very important for these young birds' survival and for them to make it to breed for the first time. So it was really exciting to be able to identify all these sites. And that's kind of most of the research updates we have so far for our Cape Cod juvenile birds. We do still have 2 more years of this research and some more tags to put out, so a lot more discovery to come. But I did just want to share how we're going to be using this data. So by tracking these juvenile birds on Cape Cod, we can actually use that information to help guide Wimbrel conservation throughout their range. So first off, we're using it to identify important sites for these birds. Like I mentioned before, Cape Cod's a really important site to prepare them for their nonstop transatlantic flights. And then those non-breeding grounds are really important to help them survive for their first few years of life. So by identifying these important sites, we can know where we need to focus our conservation efforts. This data will also contribute to a Wimbrel demographic model that we're working with with our partners. And this demographic model will help us better understand the Wimbrel population, and it can help point out where in their annual cycle the declines are happening. So then that will also help us focus our conservation efforts. Like, is it happening on the breeding grounds, on the non-breeding grounds, during migration? This model will help us learn that. So we're really excited to be contributing to, both the Wimbrel Conservation Plan and Wimbrel demographic model with our partners that are part of the Wimbrel Working Group. And we really have the goal of recovering this really incredible species. So that's all I have for you all, and I have plenty of time for questions, I believe. So thanks for joining and listening about shorebirds on Cape Cod. Yeah, are there any questions?
With the north side of Sandy Neck, or is it the other side?
Yeah, so how do the birds use Sandy Neck? Actually, have a map over here conveniently. So a lot of shorebirds like to feed within the marsh over here around Barnstable Harbor. They feed, there's a lot of extensive mud flats that get exposed during low tide. So low tides are usually spread out feeding within the marsh and mud flats. But then at high tide, a lot of them actually fly to the very tip of Sandy Neck to roost during the high tide because the water's so high, covers up all of their foraging grounds. They have nothing better to do than sleep it off. So it's pretty remote out here. I know that some vehicles can drive out there, but there's usually some fencing up for the plovers and stuff like that. So that's a really incredible place to see huge groups of birds at one time. If you get it at the right time of year. Good question. Yes.
You say they fly 2,000 miles. I can see from Cape Cod down to South America. So that's one lake. Do they do 2,000-mile lakes like from the Arctic down to Cape Cod? Cape Cod,
Yeah, so it varies a little bit between species, and even individual birds will sometimes have their own migration strategy. But shorebirds in particular do tend to do longer distance flights in between their stopovers. I know some songbirds will make shorter hops between sites, so they stop more often and fly less huge distances. But yeah, for the most part, shorebirds are making those big jumps. And some of the birds can fly even, I think, more than that and nonstop. Like some of the godwit species are just really incredible migrators. Yes.
About the size of the flock, the movie, because they seem to choose large, open. I mean,
Yeah.
see them down in Petula, but I mean, they're not stopping.
Yeah, they can fly in large flocks. You'll see some of those flocks, and not just on this slide, but in some of the photos, and as that's part of the art exhibit. But there can, be thousands in a flock. I'm not familiar with like when they're flying, how many are flying together, but when they do stop, you can have, several thousand birds in one area.
Species.
Yeah, they'll be all mixed up. Like Manomet National Wildlife Refuge. Yeah, we're having flocks of 7,000 plus, and that's just in one section of the refuge. Like refuge overall could be like 16,000, 20,000 in one day. So there can be some big flocks, and those birds might not all be traveling together. They're all just congregated there for a while, and they'll have spend differing amount of times at the stopover before like small groups of them move on. Yeah. Yes.
Can you generalize a little bit about timing right here, since we're so close to some very important sites for the beginning of the spring and fall migration?
Yeah, great question. So the spring, we'll start to have birds in April starting to trickle in, but the spring migration is the quicker migration because the birds are just trying to get to the breeding grounds, get their territory, find their mate, and breed as quickly as possible because the summer there is so short. They really need to get moving. So most of the birds in Massachusetts, I feel, will come in May into early June is when like the most birds are coming through, and you'll see the biggest flocks. But they'll be gone so quickly. We do some shorebird research in the spring, and we have like 3 weeks to get it done because the birds are in and out so quickly. But in the fall, it's much more prolonged That has to do with, the adult birds are done breeding and everything, so they have a little bit more time. And then we also have the juvenile birds coming through at that time as well. So starting probably in like mid-July, we'll start to get the earliest birds coming in. Some of them maybe they didn't have a successful breeding season, so they're heading through earlier. Some species tend to head through earlier too, so there's some differences in the species. And then that will kind of go through into like November. We'll still have shorebirds migrating through. And it tends to be that the juveniles come in like the second wave, because they hang out on the breeding grounds a little bit longer to continue preparing themselves. So yeah, it can be, you definitely see birds in Massachusetts for quite a while in the fall.
And how many, this is sort of a follow-on, same thing, you're talking about waves with the adults going first and then the juveniles. Do most of the shorebirds leave their poor offspring and go ahead?
The ones in the Arctic tend to do that. I think a lot of times the female will leave first and the male will hang out a little bit with the young for a little bit longer. But they're precocial, so they're feeding and walking around right away, just like a chicken's young. And yeah, they have, their internal navigation system to guide the way.
Yeah.
And some tracking studies have shown that the adults will have more direct routes than the juveniles too, since the juveniles are doing it for the very first time. Sometimes they're not right on target, but they still end up making it. Oh yes.
What's the average life of a shorebird? I know they're all different types. In general, do they live 10 years?
Yeah, so they clearly have a pretty challenging life, and the juveniles definitely have a lower survival rate than once they make it to adulthood, just because they're naive birds experiencing everything for the first time. But if they can make it past that, there's been some shorebirds recorded, I think, into their 20s. Like they can tell that from banding and tracking data, but I don't know what the average age is though. I'll go back to your first.
I do quite a bit of kayaking around the Cape, and coming into Quake Bay from going into St. Cloud from Quake Bay, I saw several oyster catchers there. I haven't seen oyster catchers in 10 years. And I was wondering if maybe you could say a few words about their life cycle, like you were describing the other ones. And also the difference, could you also discuss the differences between the West Coast and the East Coast oyster catchers? There's a coloration difference that's quite pronounced.
Yeah. So good call about talking about oyster catchers. So they are one of our species that breed here. We're kind of at their northern range, so they're not quite as long distance migrants as some of our other shorebirds, but they are one of Manomet's flagship species, and they're actually a really great conservation success story. So they were not doing so well, and Manomet and our partners formed a American oyster catcher working group, and they were able to figure out what the leading causes of decline were. A lot of them were the young just not making it, them up being successful during the breeding season. They got good tabs on their population, so they would, Shiloh, who this art exhibit is dedicated to, he kind of led up the American oyster catcher working group, and he would go on planes like throughout the Atlantic coast to do aerial surveys of oyster catchers to get an idea of what the population was. So they got a good idea of the population. They figured out what the main causes of their decline were. Like I said, unsuccessful breeding seasons due to things like, disturbance to their nesting sites and, predation of nests and stuff like that. And they were able to come up with a plan to address those causes for decline. So better protecting the nesting grounds. You'll see that here on Cape Cod, where they have little fencing up and all those beach rules that come during the summer. That's just to help their breeding grounds. Most of that's focused on the piping plover, but it also benefits species like the American oyster catcher. And they've actually rebounded I think 45% since they started that program. So a really great success story, and it sounds like you're benefiting from that by seeing them after, like, for the first time in 10 years. So that's fantastic. But yeah, they're a really incredible species. We're glad they're on the rebound, and yeah, Cape Cod is some of their nesting grounds. They're one of the shorebird species that are more hands-on parents. They'll actually teach their chicks how to eat. They'll bring them, so they feed on shellfish. That's why they're called oyster catchers. They'll actually bring the shellfish to the young and show them how to crack them open. So they have really long, there's one right behind there by Ashley, if you need a reminder on what they look like, but they have those great carrot chisel-like bills. They can either, smash the shells, or they can slip their bills in when the shellfish opens up just a little bit, and they sniff the little muscle that keeps them closed, and then it just pops open. So they all have their special way on how to open their food, and food that they specialize on, and they teach that all for their young, which is really sweet. And this time of year, they're all starting to group up to get ready for migration. Most of the babies have fledged, and they're all starting to get ready to migrate. And so they'll be around a little bit longer. So really great species. And I'm not that familiar with what's going on the West Coast for oyster catchers, but there are several species of oyster catcher in the world, which is cool.
So they're all black on the end.
Yeah.
Except their nose, they're pink in their eye, which is kind of like reddish orange.
Yeah.
It really stands out in coloration, more so than
Yeah. And if you're seeing them for the rest of the season, if you see some oyster catchers out there, you can use the bill to tell if it's an adult bird or a juvenile bird. The adults will have the carrot bill, and the juveniles' bills will be like dark on the tip. So you'll be able to tell if it's one of the young from this year or if it's an adult. So look out if you see them. I think we have more questions. Oh, yes.
Kind of a two-part question about the whimbrels. Do the adults use the same sites down in South America that the juveniles do? And then what's the lag time between when the adults arrive, but during the fall migration, and then the juveniles? I know they're delayed a little bit. We talking a couple of days or a few weeks?
Yeah, so I know for the timing in Massachusetts, the adults come through in like July and August. Sometimes there's like, maybe some that are a little bit later, but typically we see adults in July and August, and we'll see the juveniles in pretty much the month of September. So that's, about a month delay when they're coming through here. So it's kind of a similar arrival on the non-breeding grounds. And there is some overlap in the non-breeding sites that some of the juveniles that we've tracked at least have kept more to the northern shore of South America. Some of the adults will go a little bit further south, but they still have overlapping sites.
Right.
And the young we did during the tracking study, we realized that there's little exploration when they get down there. Sometimes they make it to their non-breeding site, but then they might, we had one in the British Virgin Islands, that it made it to the British Virgin Islands, but every now and then it'd take a trip to another island in the Caribbean just for a couple days, and then go back, and then I took maybe 4 or 5 different trips during its stay. Sounds pretty nice, island hopping in the Caribbean. We had another bird that first went to Suriname, and then randomly went to Brazil for a couple weeks, and then went back to Suriname. So the young are still a little exploratory and just figuring things. Oh, yes.
So with the Manomet spot that you said, the
National Wildlife Refuge. Yeah.
Is it accessible? Is it like you can drive, is it a parking lot, you go and look for stuff?
Yeah, so here's the map. So we have Manomet National Wildlife Refuge. It's not the best map, but there's a very small mainland portion of the refuge. It's on Morris Island in Chatham. They unfortunately are experiencing a lot of erosion there on their bluff, so they've lost a good chunk of their mainland property. There are still there's a little parking lot, and you can walk out to some trails and see some mud flats and some shorebirds. But I will say most of the action is happening on the barrier islands, which you do need a boat to get to. So, but I will say that the mainland portion is still pretty nice. We'll be doing a bird walk there, I think, on September 4th. But yeah, most of these islands are pretty remote. You need a boat to get there. There's also a lot of closed areas in the refuge. So if you do want to plan a visit, if you have like a boat or you want to charter a boat, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages them. So I recommend going to their website. They have a great map that shows you what areas are open to the public, which ones aren't. There's actually federally designated wilderness out there, if you can believe it, just, you know, a couple miles off the coast of Cape Cod, there's wilderness. And it feels like that when you go out there. It just, the birds and seals have the run of the place. But there are, I think there's a charter out of Stage Harbor, I think stageharbor.com, and he has a permit to take people out for the day. They have like a nice lighthouse too on the southern island.
You mentioned August 4th, September 4th, what are you doing?
I'm doing a bird walk at the Morris Island section of the refuge.
I mean, do people have to call Manomet to sign up or what happens?
There is a registration list on our website. Amy,
Registration.
Yeah.
That works 5%. Fine. We do a monthly bird walk on our property, which is located in Plymouth, and we have a lot of other events. Because, our brochures back here have our website on it.
Maybe everyone already knows this, but I spent a lot of time at the end of Dawson Beach. There's parking spots there. And then the tip of Long Beach meets up there. So Long Beach is uninhabited. Except for like some people that bring their dogs and get upset. But I've seen oyster catchers, I've seen the willet, there was nothing there. Definitely they're floating around all the time. It's really fun. They're so close, binoculars, you just sit in your car.
yeah. I haven't been there myself, but we do have a Shorebird Blitz volunteer who takes care of that whole area. She's great. She knows, like all the best places and, you know, tide to see all the birds and everything and how to cover it so you can get as many birds as you can. Yeah.
The other thing I was wondering about, the International Shorebird Survey, you mentioned this study, the Blitz has only been going for like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, so I didn't do it.
Manomet's been studying the area longer.
Yes. So I only briefly mentioned the International Shorebird Survey because of time reasons, but it was started by the original Manomet shorebird biologist, Brian Harrington, back in 1974. So we have over 50 years worth of shorebird data, and not just for Massachusetts, although Massachusetts is definitely one of our strongest states, but all throughout the Western Hemisphere. Canada has its own like sister survey for shorebirds up there. But yeah, tons of sites, all different countries, even into South America, and it's been a big success. So if you're interested in getting involved, you can contact me. And the data has been used most recently in 2023, a scientific paper was published that took all that International Shorebird Survey data and the Canadian shorebird data, and all these, you know, really smart people who know all the mathematical models were able to get population trends for, I think, 28 different shorebird species using all the numbers, which is really exciting to see all that volunteer collected data being used for real science. The results were a little bit discouraging, though. It showed that, you know, most of those species have declined since 1970. The graph I showed earlier with all the different groups of birds, the shorebird data for that was pulled from International Shorebird Survey data. So really great to see, you know, community science in action. Unfortunate that the results are what they are, though, but we're working to fix that. So any other questions?
How about the coordination? I mean, how much cooperation do you get from the people that don't want to drive the cars, don't want to set off fireworks? You know what I mean? Like, it is simple tasks, but it seems to be not simple. Clients, I'm just curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, so Manomet doesn't, you know, manage a site, but we do have a lot of partners that are the people that are on the ground trying to protect especially the nesting habitat for the piping plovers and oyster catchers and like least terns. So we do hear about it a lot. We just started up a Massachusetts Shorebird Alliance. We all get together and talk about the challenges of protecting shorebirds in Massachusetts. And It's always a struggle. I really admire them for sticking with it and still, working to find, cooperation and finding ways to, get people on board and compromise too. A lot of them are, open to compromising as well. So yeah, it's tough. But our migrating shorebirds also benefit a lot from some of those protections because the migration season does overlap quite a bit with the breeding season. So for a little while, at least they have some protections. And then after Labor Day comes down a little bit for them. So that's good.
Curiosity, how many people in this room use Dow's?
How many what?
How many of you go to Dow's and use Dow's? There's quite a few. So they do a wonderful, Amy, who's the nature person for Clarksville County. Is responsible for putting up the signs and the educational signs to protect the fighting plovers there. And it's just wonderful to point that out when you're on Dow's because it explains why you can't have a dog chase after a bird. And she's done a very good job. So that's kind of a typical local thing. And Amy also told me that she's had other people up and down the coast who have asked if they can use her resources in order to post it around their plover sites.
Do you feel as though the language used in these signs has driven more compliance and compassion or something? Is that why they've asked to use her material?
I think they've been impressed that if people actually read them. Because before, the signs were just, endangered bird. And nobody knew what endangered bird it was. And stay off endangered birds. So by providing information, and it made people more aware of what this bird is, what kind of bird it is. I think it has made a difference.
Good to hear. Oh, yes.
Just quickly, I went to a thing about pipe plover over at Sandy Neck, and it was really interesting because they actually now basically cordon off from the birds because it's such a big space, a fine space. They have flags, you see the flags and all that stuff. That's to prevent the birds from nesting so that you can have recreation. They're actually making a parking lot on the beach for the people that want to park on the beach and do their thing. And I think that's pretty cool because it's that combination of recreation and conservation living together. But
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know all the ins and outs, but sites are able to do a habitat management plan for shorebirds, with the state. So they work with the state wildlife agency to come up with a plan that balances the needs of their site. And they usually do some extra conservation efforts to allow for a little bit more recreation or something like that. So try to balance the needs. And biologists are always definitely talking about best ways to communicate and best ways to compromise too, or getting more into social science as well. There's to try to learn the best ways to help people and birds coexist.